Taya was a 16-year-old girl who lived in a small, peaceful village surrounded by thick forests and towering mountains. Her village was a beautiful place, with green fields, clear rivers, and bright blue skies. The people in the village were kind and hardworking, but they were also very simple. They were happy to live their lives farming, fishing, and taking care of their families. They didn't think much about the world beyond the village. But Taya was different. She had always been different. Ever since she was a little girl, she dreamed of faraway places, of grand adventures, and of discovering things no one else had ever seen. While other children played games and helped their parents, Taya would sit by the river and imagine herself as a brave explorer, traveling to unknown lands and finding hidden treasures. Her dreams made her happy, but they also made her feel out of place. Taya's parents loved her dearly, but they didn't understand her dreams. They worried about her wild ideas and often told her to focus on what was in front of her, the village, the family, and the simple life they led. "Taya, my dear," her mother would say, "why do you always have your head in the clouds? There is so much to do here in the village." "Taya, dreams are nice," her father would add, "but they won't fill your belly or keep you warm at night. You must learn to be practical." Even Taya's friends didn't understand her. They would tease her, calling her the unwanted dreamer because they thought her dreams were silly and useless. "Why do you want to leave the village, Taya?" they would ask. "Everything we need is right here. What good will your dreams do?" But Taya couldn't help it. Her heart yearned for something more. She knew there was a big world out there, full of mysteries and wonders, and she wanted to see it all. She wanted to be more than just a village girl. She wanted to be a hero, someone who would be remembered for doing something great. So even though it made her feel lonely, Taya held on to her dreams. She kept them close, like a secret treasure, and waited for the day when she would have the chance to make them come true. One day, something unusual happened in the village. A stranger arrived, and not just any stranger, but an old woman who seemed to come out of nowhere. She was dressed in strange clothes, with a long, tattered cloak and a hat that covered most of her face. Her skin was weathered and dark, and her eyes shone with a mysterious light. The villagers were frightened by the old woman. They had never seen anyone like her before, and they didn't trust strangers, especially those who looked so different. They whispered among themselves, calling her the unwanted one and keeping their distance. But Taya was not afraid. She was curious. She had never seen anyone from outside the village, and she wondered where the old woman had come from and what stories she might have to tell. The old woman didn't stay in the village. She made her home at the edge of the forest, in a small, run-down hut that had been abandoned for years. The villagers warned their children to stay away from her, saying she was dangerous and could bring bad luck. But Taya couldn't resist. One evening, just as the sun was setting, she gathered her courage and went to see the old woman. As she approached the hut, her heart pounded with excitement and a little bit of fear. What would the old woman be like? Would she be kind, or would she be as frightening as the villagers said? Taya knocked on the door, and after a moment the old woman opened it. She looked at Taya with sharp, knowing eyes, as if she had been expecting her. "Come in, child," the old woman said in a voice that was both gentle and strong. "I've been waiting for you." Taya hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The hut was small and dark, but it was filled with all sorts of strange and wonderful things. There were shelves lined with bottles of colorful liquids, jars of herbs and spices, and books with worn covers. In the center of the room was a small fire, and above it hung a pot, bubbling with something that smelled delicious. The old woman motioned for Taya to sit down, and Taya did, feeling both nervous and excited. "What brings you to my humble home, young one?" the old woman asked, sitting across from Taya and looking at her with those piercing eyes. I wanted to meet you," Taya replied, her voice shaking a little. "The villagers say you're dangerous, but I don't believe them. I think you're different, just like me." That night, Taya lay in her bed, staring at the map the old woman had given her. She could hardly believe what had happened. This was the chance she had been waiting for, the chance to make her dreams come true. But she also knew that it wouldn't be easy. The map was old and faded, but Taya could still make out the details. It showed a path leading through the dense forest that surrounded the village, across a wide river, over a steep mountain, and into a hidden valley. At the end of the path, there was a small X marking the spot where the treasure was hidden. Taya's heart raced with excitement, but she also felt a pang of fear. The journey would be dangerous, and she had never been beyond the forest before. What if she got lost? What if she couldn't find the treasure? And what if something happened to her along the way? But then she remembered the old woman's words. This journey is not just about finding treasure, it's about finding yourself. Taya knew she couldn't let fear hold her back. She had to go on this journey not just to prove herself to the villagers, but to prove to herself that she was capable of more than they thought. The next morning, Taya made her decision. She would go on the adventure, but she would keep it a secret. She knew her parents wouldn't understand, and they would try to stop her if they knew. So she started to quietly prepare, gathering the things she would need for the journey. She packed a small bag with food, water, a blanket, and a few other essentials. She also took a knife for protection, a rope for climbing, and a small hand-drawn map of the village and surrounding areas that she had made over the years. Finally, she tucked the old woman's map safely into her bag. Taya spent the day saying goodbye to the village in her own way. She visited the places that were special to her. The river where she used to sit and dream, the big tree where she would climb and look out at the horizon, and the small garden behind her house where she would go to think. As the sun began to set, Taya knew it was time to go. She left a note for her parents, telling them not to worry and that she would be back soon. She didn't want them to be scared or angry, but she also knew she couldn't stay. With her bag on her back and her heart full of hope and determination, Taya quietly slipped out of her house and into the night. The village was silent as she walked through the streets, the only sound being the soft rustling of the wind in the trees. Taya felt a mix of emotions: excitement, fear, sadness, but she knew she was doing the right thing. When she reached the edge of the forest, she paused for a moment and looked back at the village. It looked so small and peaceful in the moonlight. And for a brief moment, Taya wondered if she should turn back. But then she remembered the old woman's words and the dream she had held in her heart for so long. Taking a deep breath, Taya turned away from the village and stepped into the forest. The journey had begun. The forest was dark and full of shadows as Taya made her way along the narrow path. The trees were tall and close together, their branches intertwining overhead like a thick, leafy roof. The air was cool and damp, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Taya had always loved the forest, but being in it at night was a different experience. It felt mysterious and a little bit scary, as if the trees themselves were watching her, waiting to see what she would do. But Taya pushed her fear aside and focused on the map. She knew she had to follow the path through the forest to reach the river, the first major obstacle on her journey. The map showed that the river was wide and fast-flowing, and Taya wasn't sure how she would cross it, but she knew she would figure it out when she got there. As she walked, Taya thought about the old woman and the stories she had told. The woman had seen so much of the world, and Taya wondered what it would be like to be that wise and experienced. She hoped that this journey would help her grow and become stronger, just like the old woman. The path was rough and uneven, and Taya had to be careful not to trip on the roots and rocks that jutted out of the ground. She walked for what felt like hours, her legs growing tired and her eyes heavy with sleep. But she knew she couldn't stop now. She had to keep going. Finally, after what seemed like forever, Taya heard the sound of rushing water. Her heart lifted as she realized she was close to the river. She quickened her pace, eager to reach it. When she emerged from the trees, she saw the river before her. It was just as the old woman had described, wide, fast, and full of swirling currents. The water was dark and powerful, and Taya knew it would be dangerous to try to swim across. She looked around for a way to cross. There was no bridge, and the water was too deep and strong to wade through. For a moment, Taya felt a wave of doubt. How would she get across? Then she remembered the rope in her bag. It was long and sturdy, and Taya thought it might be just what she needed. She quickly took it out and began looking for a place to tie it. After a bit of searching, she found a large, strong tree that leaned out over the river. Its branches were thick and twisted, and Taya knew it would hold her weight. She tied one end of the rope securely to the tree, and then threw the other end across the river, hoping it would catch on something on the other side. It took a few tries, but finally the rope caught on a rock on the opposite bank. Taya tested it, pulling hard to make sure it was secure. When she was satisfied, she took a deep breath and began to cross. Hand over hand, Taya pulled herself across the rope, her legs dangling above the rushing water. It was hard work, and her arms ached from the effort, but she didn't let go. She knew she had to keep going. About halfway across, Taya felt her grip slipping. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She tightened her hold on the rope and kept moving, inch by inch, until finally she reached the other side. Exhausted but relieved, Taya collapsed on the riverbank, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made it. She had crossed the river. The next day, Taya awoke to the sound of birds singing in the trees. She had slept in a small clearing, using her blanket to keep warm. The sun was just rising, casting a golden light through the forest, and Taya felt a renewed sense of determination. She ate a small breakfast from the food she had packed, then studied the map again. According to the map, the next part of her journey would take her to the mountains. The mountains were steep and rugged, and Taya knew they would be a difficult challenge. After packing her things, Taya set off again. The path wound through the forest, gradually leading upwards. As she climbed higher, the trees began to thin out, and the air grew cooler. Soon, Taya found herself at the base of the mountain, looking up at the towering peaks. The mountain was covered in rocks and boulders, with narrow ledges and steep cliffs. The path ahead was steep and treacherous, and Taya knew she would have to be careful. One wrong step could send her tumbling down the mountainside. But Taya didn't let fear stop her. She began to climb, using her hands and feet to scramble up the rocky slope. The climb was hard and slow, and Taya's muscles ached with the effort. But she kept going, determined to reach the top. As she climbed, Taya thought about her family and the village. She wondered what they were doing and if they had found the note she left. She missed them, but she also knew she couldn't turn back. This journey was her chance to prove herself, to show that she was more than just a dreamer. The higher Taya climbed, the more difficult the path became. The rocks were loose and slippery, and the wind howled around her, making it hard to keep her balance. But Taya didn't give up. She kept moving one step at a time, until she finally reached a small ledge where she could rest. Breathing heavily, Taya sat down and looked out at the view. From this height, she could see the forest below, stretching out like a green blanket. The river she had crossed looked like a thin silver ribbon, winding through the trees. It was a beautiful sight, and Taya felt a sense of accomplishment. But she knew she couldn't stay long. The sun was already high in the sky, and she still had a long way to go. After resting for a few minutes, Taya got up and continued her climb. As she neared the top of the mountain, Taya encountered her next challenge. The path ahead was blocked by a large boulder, too big to climb over. Taya looked around for another way, but the cliffs on either side were too steep. For a moment, Taya felt discouraged. How was she supposed to get past this obstacle? But then she remembered the rope in her bag. Maybe she could use it to create a new path. Taya tied one end of the rope to a nearby rock, then threw the other end over the boulder. She tested the rope, pulling on it to make sure it was secure. Then, with a deep breath, she began to climb. It was a difficult climb, and Taya's arms ached as she pulled herself up the rope. But she didn't give up. She kept moving, inch by inch, until she finally reached the top of the boulder. With a sigh of relief, Taya looked ahead and saw that the path continued on the other side. She had made it past the obstacle. As Taya continued her journey, she faced more challenges. She had to cross narrow ledges, climb steep cliffs, and navigate through dark, winding caves. Each challenge tested her strength, courage, and determination. But Taya didn't give up. She knew that each step brought her closer to her goal. Finally, after what felt like days of climbing, Taya reached the top of the mountain. The view from the summit was breathtaking. She could see for miles in every direction, the landscape stretching out before her like a vast, endless sea. But Taya didn't stop to admire the view. She knew that the hardest part of the journey was still ahead. Taya began her descent down the other side of the mountain. The path was just as steep and treacherous as before, but Taya had grown stronger and more confident. As she descended, Taya noticed that the landscape was changing. The air grew warmer, and the trees became taller and thicker. The rocks were covered in moss, and the ground was soft and damp underfoot. Taya realized she was entering the hidden valley that the old woman had spoken of. The valley was a mysterious and magical place. The trees were ancient and twisted, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was filled with the sound of birdsong and the rustling of leaves, and Taya could see strange plants and flowers growing in the underbrush. Taya felt a sense of awe as she entered the valley. This was the place where the treasure was hidden, the place where she would prove herself. But she also felt a sense of caution. The valley was beautiful, but it was also full of dangers. As Taya made her way deeper into the valley, she encountered more challenges. The path was overgrown with thorny bushes and tangled vines, and she had to use her knife to cut her way through. The ground was uneven and slippery, and Taya had to be careful not to lose her footing. But Taya didn't let these challenges stop her. She kept moving forward, her eyes fixed on the map. According to the map, the treasure was hidden in a cave at the far end of the valley. Taya knew she was getting close. Finally, after hours of walking, Taya reached the entrance to the cave. It was a dark, narrow opening in the side of a cliff, partially hidden by vines and moss. Taya felt a mix of excitement and fear as she stood before it. This was it, the final challenge. Taking a deep breath, Taya stepped into the cave. The cave was cold and dark, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. Taya could hear the sound of dripping water echoing through the tunnels, and the walls were slick with moisture. She lit a small torch she had brought with her, the flame flickering weakly in the darkness. The map showed that the treasure was hidden deep within the cave, in a chamber at the very end of the tunnel. Taya knew she had to be careful. The cave was full of twists and turns, and it would be easy to get lost. As Taya made her way deeper into the cave, she encountered her final challenge. The path ahead was blocked by a deep chasm, too wide to jump across. The only way to reach the other side was to walk across a narrow, slippery ledge that ran along the wall of the cave. Taya felt a surge of fear as she looked at the ledge. It was barely wide enough for her feet, and the drop below was so deep that she couldn't see the bottom. One wrong step, and she would fall. But Taya knew she couldn't turn back now. She had come too far, and she couldn't let fear stop her. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and began to carefully inch her way across the ledge. It was slow, nerve-wracking work. The ledge was slippery, and Taya's heart pounded in her chest as she moved along it. But she didn't let herself panic. She focused on each step, making sure her feet were secure before moving forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Taya reached the other side of the chasm. She let out a sigh of relief and took a moment to catch her breath. She had done it. She had faced her fear and overcome it. With renewed determination, Taya continued through the cave. She could feel that she was close to the treasure. The tunnel began to widen and the air grew warmer. The walls of the cave glittered with crystals, and Taya knew she was entering the final chamber. When she stepped into the chamber, Taya's breath caught in her throat. The room was filled with a soft golden light, and in the center of the chamber was a small ancient chest covered in dust and cobwebs. Taya approached the chest with trembling hands. She had done it. She had found the treasure. But as she reached out to open the chest, she hesitated. The old woman's words echoed in her mind. This journey is not just about finding treasure. It's about finding yourself. Taya realized that the treasure wasn't just gold or jewels. It was the courage, strength, and determination she had discovered within herself. She had faced her fears, overcome challenges, and proven that she was capable of more than anyone had ever believed. With a smile, Taya opened the chest. Inside, she found a small, simple object, a pendant, made of silver and shaped like a star. It was beautiful, but not valuable in a material sense. But to Taya, it was priceless. It was a symbol of her journey, of everything she had achieved. Taya placed the pendant around her neck and felt a warm, comforting glow fill her heart. She had found the true treasure, the treasure of self-discovery. With the pendant safely around her neck, Taya made her way out of the cave. The journey back through the valley and over the mountain was just as challenging as before, but Taya felt different now. She felt stronger, more confident, and more at peace with herself. When Taya finally returned to the village, she was greeted with a mixture of surprise and awe. The villagers had thought she was lost, but here she was, standing before them, stronger and braver than ever. Taya's parents hugged her tightly, tears of relief in their eyes. They could see that something had changed in their daughter. that she was no longer the same girl who had left the village. She was a young woman now, full of strength and wisdom. And as for the villagers, they no longer saw Taya as unwanted. They saw her as a hero, someone who had gone on a great adventure and returned with a treasure far greater than gold. Taya smiled as she looked around at the people who had once doubted her. She had found her place in the world, not by seeking approval from others, but by following her heart and believing in herself. And as she stood there, with the pendant around her neck and the memory of her journey in her heart, Taya knew that she was no longer unwanted. She was a dreamer, an adventurer, and a hero in her own right, and that was the greatest treasure of all.